All right, welcome to week 16, the final week of the semester. We're here at last. This week we're dealing with the formulation and conduct of foreign policy, which is a subject that I happen to teach as a standalone subject, so I'll try not to overwhelm you. The government conducts foreign policy with three principal aims: national defense, national security, and the betterment of the world, whatever that means. What does the federal government do to protect the nation's territory? Certainly, part of the appeal of Donald Trump's presidential campaign was to promise to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border, claiming that a wall would secure our southern border. Quick question: does anyone think building a wall is going to stop the movement of undocumented immigrants across our southern border? My opinion, I'll be happy to elaborate with anyone who would care to ask. But short answer is uh, walls can be surmounted, walls can be dug under, walls can be flown over, walls can be swum around. Uh, it's very difficult for me to think of the wall really doing much uh, to stop illegal immigration, particularly because we're accustomed to having people coming from south of the border to do agricultural work. They've been coming in the millions for over a century. That's been a mutually beneficial relationship. And us basically trying to stop that is actually hurting ourselves to some extent. And again, I'll elaborate for anyone that wants to talk about it. The federal government also has responsibility for advancing the nation's economic interests as well. How do the governments, how does the government do that? Have you read about the efforts of the federal government to advance American interests abroad? That happens to be another area that Donald Trump claimed during the campaign that the previous administration had made bad deals with other countries and that he would renegotiate trade agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement and with Canada and Mexico, our two largest trading partners. Based on what you've learned from the media, how are these kinds of efforts going? We've obviously renegotiated NAFTA. Uh, what are the advantages and disadvantages of tearing up agreements that previous administrations had made with other countries in hopes of striking a better deal? Um, you know, Trump has actually tried the tied the wall, building the wall to American prosperity, arguing during the campaign that he would build the wall and that Mexico would pay for it. Again, that's another instance where I think the president's lack of political understanding and political experience basically caused him to make promises he would never be able to keep. There's also a third aspirational element of American foreign policy, and that is the perception that we have an obligation to try and make the world a better, safer place. Presidents like Jimmy Carter emphasized human rights as an element of U.S. foreign policy and tried to pressure regimes that mistreated their citizens into respecting basic human rights. Um, a significant element of U.S. tensions with Iran have stemmed from the regime's potentially destabilizing actions in the Middle East, which is an incredibly important region that contains much of the world's proven oil reserves. Iran has been designated by the U.S. State Department as a sponsor of terrorism, referencing Iran's training and arming of non-governmental organizations like Hezbollah, which is a political organization that advances the aims of Shiite Muslims in Lebanon and Syria. I'll stop for a second and ask, does everyone know the difference between a Sunni and a Shiite Muslim? If not, we can take that up again in the forum. Back to Iran. The United States and 5 other nations imposed harsh economic sanctions on Iran in response to mounting evidence that the regime was engaged in a determined effort to develop nuclear weapons. That package of economic sanctions was in place between 2006 and 2015 and included bans on the sale of Iranian oil and a pretty thoroughgoing trade embargo. If you want to know what a trade embargo is, I can talk about that in the forum as well. Those sanctions devastated the Iranian economy and gave the international community the leverage to force Iran to stop its attempt to develop nuclear weapons. So in 2015, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, and Germany signed an agreement in which Iran promised to stop enriching uranium and agreed to periodic inspections of its nuclear facilities in exchange for a relaxation of the economic sanctions. The Trump administration pulled out of that deal, claiming it didn't go far enough. Knowing what you know and learning from outside, how would you evaluate the Trump administration's decision to pull out of that deal? Is Trump helping to make the world a better, safer place? Um, with that in mind, Iran has been hard hit by the coronavirus. Should we be relaxing the sanctions that we have in place, which again are devastating, again, the Iranian economy? Uh, Move on. How has the United States' position in the world changed since independence? I jokingly refer in my foreign policy class as the United States as a super duper power, owing to our unprecedented wealth and the strength of our military. But the United States in 1787 was a fledgling nation with huge debts and a non-existent military. When did the United States, make that transition from being a relatively modest country to, being the most wealthy and the most militarily powerful country in the world? Um, would you say that we are gaining or losing power relative to the rest of the world in the current environment? For much of U.S. history, the dominant attitude of Americans towards the world was expressed in the idea of isolationism. So, what is isolationism, and how did that impact Americans' view of the outside world? How isolationist was the United States from 1787 to 1945? Is there a wellspring of isolationist sentiment within American political culture, still there waiting to be tapped? What would a return to isolationism mean for the United States and for the rest of the world? The text discusses new threats to U.S. national security and addresses the Bush administration's war on terrorism and what is known as the Bush Doctrine. What were the key elements of the war on terrorism? What does the Bush Doctrine say about the United States' willingness to resort to military action? How effective would you say the Bush and Obama administrations were in countering the threat of terrorist organizations like Al Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah, and Hamas? One of the more important parts of Chapter 14 concerns the agencies responsible for conducting foreign policy. As we learned in Chapter, I believe, 12, you actually, or 11, I think, you actually have to have a bureaucracy in place in order to implement policy. So this chapter has an element of bureaucracy as well. Journalists who specialize in foreign policy talk about the Golden Triangle, which refers to the White House, the Pentagon, and Foggy Bottom, which is where that's the headquarters of the State Department. The president has a great deal of authority over how foreign policy is conducted, and foreign policy analysts note that presidents over the last 60 years have increasingly conducted a White House-centered foreign policy, which means that presidents are conducting foreign policy directly using the National Security Council. That also means that cabinet secretaries wield a lot less influence than they did previously. Now, that has conferred a great deal of influence on the National Security Council staff and the National Security Advisor, who is appointed by the president and is ultimately not subject to Senate confirmation. Again, what are the significance of presidents basically being able to run foreign policy directly rather than having to rely on the State Department? To a large extent, they increasingly find themselves working a lot through the Department of Defense. And defense is a huge bureaucratic organization. So of the two departments that still play a significant role, state and defense, the defense is huge, like I said. State Department, in contrast, is primarily responsible for diplomacy, and so the Secretary of State is responsible for carrying out the president's foreign policy vision. Recently, or not so recently these days, President Trump dismissed his first Secretary of State, former ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson, and he did so via tweet. Why do you think Tillerson was fired? And ultimately, what's going on at the Department of State? At this point, I'll pause and give you guys some context. The Secretary of State was historically the principal foreign policy conduit for the president. In the 19th and early 20th century, the Secretaries of State were essentially the primary foreign policy actors. Some presidents in that period didn't commit much attention to foreign policy because foreign policy just wasn't that important. That changed in the immediate aftermath of World War II for two reasons. First, the end of World War II saw the United States take a much higher foreign policy profile, and presidents were compelled to commit more attention and energy to foreign policy. Second, the creation of the National Security Council provided presidents with a conduit for circumventing state and conducting, foreign policy directly. All that said, Secretaries of State occupy a very sensitive position within the foreign policy community. They wear several hats. They're the chief diplomat. They're the public face of the government. They are, they're also an important actor within the intelligence community. That makes the job of Secretary of State really difficult, and it's no small reason why the several of the more recent Secretaries of State have faced a great deal of controversy and criticism. Now, in contrast, defense is huge, both in terms of sheer size and the scope of its responsibility. The defense secretary and the civilian leadership in the Pentagon are responsible for formulating plans for defending national security and advancing U.S. national interests over a variety of scenarios and in a variety of regions that are sensitive to U.S. Security interests. So, for example, if there's a problem with Muslim militants in Niger, a country in northern Africa that has huge deposits of uranium, then the military has to develop plans for dealing with that kind of problem. So what role does Congress play in the formulation and conduct of foreign policy? It would be easy to say that Congress plays second fiddle to the president, but Congress does have a role. The Senate in particular has that advise and consent power that we've talked about in chapters 9 and 10. Which is, again, the power for the Senate to basically say, wait, you just appointed this guy. Let's find out if he's actually appropriate. The House likewise has the appropriation authority, and Congress collectively exerts significant influence over the budget allotted to foreign policy. Both houses of Congress have oversight power and can use that power to support, investigate, publicize, and or oppose the president's foreign policy initiatives. The last comment I'll make on Chapter 14 is the role that the public plays in foreign policy. As a rule, only a tiny segment of the American public is both interested in and knowledgeable of foreign affairs. This is what political scientists describe as the attentive public. Americans generally only pay close attention to foreign affairs when there's a likelihood of war, but even then, most Americans' attention span as it relates to foreign affairs is pretty short. We should also note that the U.S. has been in a state of war basically since 2001. Are Americans getting war weary? Should the United States end its occupations, in Afghanistan and Iraq and or go for the win, whatever that means? What would victory in Afghanistan require in terms of monetary and personnel commitments? There have been instances where public opinion has impacted foreign policy significantly. Americans' unhappiness with the conduct of the Vietnam War clearly led Lyndon Johnson to basically turn down attempting to seek re-election in 1968. Democrats swept midterm elections in 2006 largely as a result of unhappiness over the conduct of the Iraq occupation. And likely was an important consideration Americans turning to Barack Obama in 2008. Should Americans be more concerned about foreign affairs? What could be done to improve Americans' awareness of foreign affairs? Is there a public policy solution to these particular problems? All right. Hopefully this video will have given you plenty to think about and to discuss. As always, if you have any questions, this is the place to get some answers. You may not like the answers, but that's part of the process of becoming educated. Confronting information you don't necessarily, agree with, or confirms your bias, which again we all have. On a personal note, I hope you've learned a lot over the course of the semester and that you have a better understanding of American federal government having taken this course with me. And I hope you all have, a great break, and I hope you all have good fortune in your future endeavors. Thank you.